Hemisphere. They have very different histories, and we'll be looking at the two of them. The cultures in the Western Hemisphere, there are two main cultures, the written narratives culture and the oral traditions. Obviously, the oral traditions of the ancients are very important, and the majority of people who live in the Arctic Circle in the Western Hemisphere are Inuits. They are indigenous people. We'll be looking at a number of different themes. The geography and climate influences the cultures themselves, the foreign impacts and traditional and contemporary trends that are happening. So if we go back to what we know about the Arctic, we think about the Arctic Circle. In truth, that's the blue dotted line, and it represents the very top of the latitudes on the globe. And of course, the tilt of the globe is the reason we have, and the spinning of it is the reason we have seasons and changes. The little red circles shown are the areas that I'll be talking about. The red line is the isotherm, which means this is the warmest it usually gets within the Arctic environment. We're all worried about the maintenance of the polar caps, and part of that is because there is a phenomenon which is the permafrost, which basically has frozen water within the ground, and that stabilizes the ground on which all things are built. This slide shows a number of different situations. In the upper left, you'll see areas that are frozen, and you'll find the unfrozen areas, which they call the talik. And you will find this is north on this side, south on this side. And you can see what happens below on the left when the permafrost releases itself, meaning the soil starts to disintegrate because the liquid ice, the liquid water allows everything to collapse. And there's an example here in Russia of a building whose foundation has been undermined, and so the whole corner collapsed. And in Alaska, there's a building there where the soil just disappeared, and so the building collapsed off its location. As I mentioned before, the Arctic area is inhabited on the west. The little diagram on the left here shows the percentage of population which is actually indigenous today. And you can see that over 75% in much of this area on the Western Hemisphere. There's the larger map shows all the different cultures. Those I'll be talking about, in this case, the northwest line is horizontal on the big map. So you can see the Americas and Greenland on the west, and Russia and part of Europe on the east. In this North American section, you'll see the different types of Eskimos that I'll be talking about, and the primary locations of these people. The time the Dorset culture was the first one that's recorded with sufficient artifacts to think about identifying these people. And they lived, as you can see, from 500 BC to 1500 current era. The blue shows the Thule culture, which is a proto-Inuit culture. And I'll use the word Inuit instead of Eskimo through this whole presentation. The little sketch, the yellowest sketch on this side, on the right, shows housing that's actually built from the bones of whales that set down into the earth. So the indigenous cultures in this Thule village has 4 basic types, which have to do with basically their permanence. What we think of as the igloo is called the igloo viak, which is a snow house, but it's preceded by larger structures that actually use these bones. And then we have the karmak, which is a tent, but it's also set into the earth with a recessed entrance. And the tupek that we see is actually the tent where the people have been traveling nomadically to follow the reindeer or move towards different hunting areas and where they can use their kayaks. The large vessel that you see in the bottom inset is called an omiak, and it's actually a 6-person boat, a crew made out of skins, and the structure is actually bones, and they're hunting whales. The odd bag-like things there are actually blown up seal skins, which are tied together. And when they kill the whale, then they have to support it so it doesn't sink. And then they have to drag it back to the village so it can be cut up. So here's some fairly ingenious computer graphics, which show one particular site in Bathurst Island in Nunavut, which is one of the territories in Canada. And you can see the ribs and actually part of the bones of the jaw and other elements that are used in creating this shed. As I said before, basically they use the bones and then they covered it with skins from polar bears or reindeer or seals or whatever. And then they covered that with sod. What we recognize in the romance of the Eskimos was actually first brought back and talked about in the 1860s, although there are people from the 1600s who were brought back by early explorers. I think we've all had the experience in part of our education of how you build an igloo. And it shows here they use a snow knife, which is usually made of ivory or jawbones of reindeers, ivory of walruses. And it's actually built, as you can see from this photograph on the upper right, as a I'm looking for the word. It's basically a tilted structure. It doesn't sort of fit the diagram that one sees in the drawing, it's done that way so that it doesn't collapse on itself, and it basically can be built by one person. However, the community of Inuits is a very highly socialized communities who have very strict ways of living with one another so that they can maintain themselves during the long winters without troubles. So they're highly socialized in their own way. Often there's a piece of ice that's put in to create a view, and there's often also portholes which take care of some of the smells. So those of you who are architects or know about these things, spatial will realize that the basic shape creates the most volume with the least amount of surface area, which is great in the cold climate to prevent giving too much surface to the coldness of the outside. Secondly, we all know that heat rises. And so within the typical igloos, there is a lower portion that you enter, and then you actually sit on the higher portion, which are covered with skins for comfort. Here's a photograph from, I think it's 1903, of a very large igloo viat. Now, going back to some of these Karmaks, we can see them on Resolute Bay. In the town of Resolute, they still survive from centuries ago. There's a reconstruction of the structure that was used, and also on Bathurst. Well, there's also on Bathurst Island, which is the lower right. There are a series of mounds that show where people lived. Moving on, the Netsilik Inuit in Pele Bay in Nunavut, which is a territory in Canada that I'll be talking about. There are records that show how people lived. 1 and 2 are on the bay, meaning in snow houses during the winter, and then they move to Quamraks, and then finally to the Tupiks, which are the summer quarters. And also, as they do this, they're looking at their the different types of diets that they have found during the year. In 1954, the Canadian government finally decided that they had to collect the people and start to acculturate them. And so they actually minimized the amount of nomadic activity that could occur, still allowing them to do this, to follow their regular way of working and living, but it was quite a dramatic change. These are the kayaks I showed you before, the large rendering of the large umiak, and this shows that indeed dog sleds help to transport the kayaks between seasons, and they did have some wood, which usually was found as driftwood that was used to form it. You can see the skins that cover the element. Here, this shows fairly clearly the Inuit dressing procedure, and also the the way they worked. Basically, the fur was on the inside of the skin on the first layer and then on the outside for subsequent layers. And also we see this bone mask for snow blindness, and quite beautiful outfits. They were known for the art they create, and they still do. What you see is a Arctic snow knife from the 1800s, made from a walrus tusk, and you can see part of an antler that was used as a grip for toggle they used to carry bundles, and you can see an enlarged bear's tooth, which was used as a lure. And on the bottom is a very special device. The one on the bottom right is a piece of shale that's been sharpened that has a wooden handle. And the other one is a 20th century item that was made by the Hudson Bay company, which performs the same function. These were used to separate the skin from the blubber and to also make clothes. Okay, now we go to the European impacts on the Arctic, and this is a quick diagram to show the different paths that were tried. I'll be talking a little bit about things that happened on the northwest side. Martin Frobisher was the first, and he reached the coast of Baffin Island. Henry Hudson came after him. John Parker was of the 1670s, was an explorer who carefully found and documented Hudson Bay. John Franklin had 3 expeditions. The final one was not successful, and the bodies and the boats were not found until the 21st century. Roland Amundsen took a small sloop and actually was the first person to navigate the whole path. This is a rendering that was done by someone who traveled on one of Barent's voyages. So I have to move right into the exploitation of North America Arctic. Basically, the land was given by an empress to her cousin, her nephew, actually Prince Rupert of Great Britain in 1670. He had all rights to the lands of Hudson Bay. But you can see by the little yellow dots up in here that the posts in the Arctic were late in coming. And the, let's call it pink dots are from the Northwest Company and also the Inland Company. And basically that was all formed as a large group. The little red dot here is at Port Leopold, which is that dot right there, which is that dot right there, which basically indicates these late coming trading posts in the Arctic. It wasn't until 1868 that Rupert's land was turned over to Canada. So on this theme of exploitation and territorial claims, it's proceeded through the 20th and 21st century. This diagram shows the areas that people claim as theirs. The North Pole is right here. But you can see that there's much disagreement about who has what. This is an open pit iron ore mine on Baffin Island, and this is a diamond mine on Baffin Island, and that they have structures that were basically built to make that work. To show the notion of the scope of the Northwest Territory, we don't get a sense of how big it was or how long it lasted. It contracted with time. By 1949, it was one space that went all the way from the west, from what was the US, Alaska, over to just above Quebec. It was in 2001, it was divided, Northwest Territory was divided into two territories. And the areas that I'm looking at are Resolute Bay and Resolute, Cambridge Bay. Here's Resolute Bay, Cambridge Bay. Here's Pelly Bay, which I talked about in the diagram that showed the movement of the people. And there is Frobisher Bay, which is named after John Frobisher, the explorer. And the orange dotted line shows actually the trip of John Franklin and his final voyage in 1847. And below you can see modern Frobisher Bay, which is now called Iqaluit.
This is beautiful.
The territory is Nunavut. Baffin Island, the two red dots that are on this map, one is the diamond mine, and the other is where the open iron core iron mine is. The coloring on the maps show the pink or coral is completely barren. The greenish tint is barren with lichen and moss, and the yellowish, it has grass with it. So here's what Baffin Island looks like. And you can see from the red circle, the little community. To give you an idea, there are only 38,000 people in Nunavut territory. There are only 7,700 people in Iqaluit, which is the capital city of Nunavut territory, which means it's slightly bigger than Rockland. It professes to have a growth rate that goes beyond. You can see basically the different seasonal views of this. And here are the critters who inhabit and surround Baffin Island. And these are still hunted and used as food sources. Going back, the early exploration and contact with Baffin Island, you can see actually the boat, the ship that made 3 voyages, the family that was actually captured and taken back to England, where they died, unfortunately, and a commemorative stamp that shows Frobisher. Okay, in 1684, the first fur factory was actually built on Hudson's Bay. This was a collection point for the different trading posts so they could get things ready to send back. So here's a European footprint, right? This is a building from 1949 that replaced the post of 1914 that was on Baffin Island. And this shows the level to which people traded furs. Of course, modern impacts included the defense lines that were sent up. There was an air base in Frobisher Bay. In 1942, the DEW line, the Defense Early Warning Radar System, went across the US, Canada, and part of Greenland. And each one of these places contained radar equipment, but they had 30 technicians that lived on site at each station. And they could only get their equipment brought in by plane for 2 months out of the year. And there was also, where there wasn't sea ice, there was the ability to bring in things on ships at certain parts of the year. So remember I said 1954 was the beginning of the culturation of the local people. And here shows a school in Apex, which is about 6 kilometers from Frobisher Bay, the town, which is now Iqaluit. And also there was an Anglican church that was built around the same time. Here's the school, which was in use and was burnt down in 2011. They basically taught English. And so if you take a look at this early class, that's the first teacher in the school, you can see that they had a lot to learn. The desks were foreign to them, and they had different languages, a new language they had to learn. They were from an oral tradition. There were missionaries that came, but basically that class is now the people who are in charge of the government up there with system. Okay, the Inuit settlement of 1949 was makeshift, ramshackle. It was built, and you can see people sitting within, extended families dealing with exactly what they could get. There were grand visions in the 20th century. Basically in the 1950s, there was a scheme to design this, we'll call it utopian, but I don't believe so. This for 4,500 people. Here is one that was done a little later. It's called Newtown 2. It's in the same location, and it's more sympathetic to, let's say, the modern movement and what should be done in new buildings. Some of this was realized in a way. And then there was the romantic Ralph Erskine, who designed the walled community where people were protected from the winds. Although you can see, he calls it an ecological Arctic town. There are windmills there. The wall is an occupied wall. And then there are small units below that are cascaded down. The Inuit population weren't necessarily convinced by this. They didn't like the idea of the people from away, the Kalunuts, it's a name for white people, being part of the wall and looking down over them, keeping track of them. Oh, he got one project built at Resolute, which could be seen as similar to one portion of a wall, which of course was a series of townhouses which were later turned into an inn in Resolute. They moved from the ramshackle to these prefabricated dwellings made of plywood, which didn't contain much. You'll see that they have lifted foundations so that they don't disturb the permafrost. Moshe Safdie took a crack at it with his plans of what should be done at Frobisher Bay. And again, the living space is lifted above the land, and basically an entry and storage is all that sits on the ground. They unfortunately moved forward with what they called a Matchbox Design, which was basically a simple box, which we may think looks a lot like shipping cargoes of today, right? And again, the amenities were minimal. At least they had a toilet and a sink. And here's the Weber home, which was designed and used in many different areas, which has basically, I have to speed up a bit, which is again up on discs. You will see in the bathtub and on the utility room table, and over here, there's people who are dressing and butchering animals. And this photo from 2006 shows people sitting and actually dressing a seal for the meat and skins. The insulation that was needed was quite dramatic. Here you can see the raised floor so that the permafrost base is not disturbed. You can see sensitivity to the positioning of buildings to avoid large piles of snow in the wrong place, so that the orientation was done to control drifting. Here's some of the later models from the 80s. And you'll see right here something called a sewage holding tank under raised bathroom, sewage holding tank under stair, sewage holding tank under stair. Different models provided for the very simple and straightforward housing. It was provided, and you can see this stays today. You can see the power line, and you can see the dish so that they can get their hit of television or whatever satellite reception they can get. Coming with these towns was something called a utilidor, which is basically, it's a corridor for utilities. And they finally decided they had to have a place for fresh water to come in and for sewage to leave, and had to have schemes within the town to take care of these things. And they often, early solutions were for trucks to come and bring fresh water and take away sewage. And then they went to these utilidors. Within Frobisher Bay, they finally realized part of that plan with high rises, 8 stories, 6 stories, office rental, movie theaters. And you can see how it's laid out. Again, it's only 7,500 people. The Astro Hill complex, which I showed you in the last slide, is here. High school, Arctic College, City Hall, Cathedral, an elementary school. And basically the location of these within the core of the city. The fire station sits on the ground level and the city hall sits above it. And this area here is a gigantic arena. That's the interior. In 2017, they built an aquatic center. And then finally, as the 20th century was closing, they became the territorial government seat. And this is the legislature building. It was done for that. You can see here the assembly chamber. The sense of community is very important. Those are sealskins on the back of these chairs. And also the Justice Center with the courts, the Royal Mounted Police, their Division 5 headquarters, and other administrative buildings. The high school built in the 70s that opened in late 1971 shows the interior view. This shows also on the bottom left the setup for the stage for the July 13th, 2020 graduation exercises within the gymnasium. The elementary school, of course, its population grew and they needed more space. So that in 1973, the pressure was taken off that little school that I showed you before in the very beginning from 1956, I think. And open plan classrooms were done. And here you can see Canadian Flag Day and Science Day. This shows the details of this. This was done during a period where they used fiberglass insulated panels. And near the end, here we are, the center, the Nunavut Arctic College, the Nunavut campus. The little red arrows here show where the photographs were taken. These two views are the upper level. These two views are the lower level. A community space, orientation towards the south. One might think this is nighttime, but it could be daytime in December. This is the only museum in the Nunavut territory. And it's actually a retrofitted Hudson's Bay storage building that was moved. They have a modern airport in red, very carefully designed. And the diagram down here is something strange. These are not lances of some sort. These are thermosiphons to actually bleed off any heat that might develop under the floor. Again, so they don't compromise the permafrost base. The churches, the first cathedral, 1972, there was a fire, it was rebuilt in 2012, the Catholic Church and the mosque. Housing remains a big issue and people are still living. They say they're homeless, but a lot of the people move from relative to relative during the winter so they have a place to stay. the place has become a haven for tourism. And so that's a great benefit to them. This is the new Canadian Arctic Research Station for Aboriginal Affairs and Northern Development of Canada at Cambridge Bay, which is the area where they found the two ships. And there are some of the interior views you can see, the gathering space. They invite the Inuit people who are still a majority within the territory to come and give their oral histories and relate the stories. And it's quite an interesting place. So I'm going to end on something that's not a piece of architecture, but is actually a place that we all should realize is important to maintain, and that is the vulnerable habitats in the Arctic for the other members who occupy this place. With that, I end.
Thank you so much, Brooke. If anyone has any questions for Brooke, this would be a great time to go ahead and type them into the chat box, and I'll go ahead and read them aloud. Thank you for the overview of the Inuit architecture and the history of the area and the evolving influences. And I wanted to ask you, do you happen to know, are there communities that are popping up as a result of the acculturation that you mentioned, where groups of people are purposefully getting back together or getting together to have something similar to what we had with the return to the land movement, but a return to traditional architecture? Are you seeing, or have you heard about a lot of communities popping up where they're trying to?
I haven't found things like that occurring. There are some places like that in Greenland that are basically places where people gather to listen to oral histories and to learn about the cultures. Often they're guided by people from away. The Canadian government, what they call the Crown, gives a lot of support to these people. And what you'll see from Judy's is that on the eastern side, it was developed in a much different way. On the Western hemisphere, it was left very empty. And basically people were able to maintain their lifestyles from the 5th century BCE all the way to the 1940s or 50s. And they basically were subsistence communities that lived together quietly, had their rituals and their traditions, song and dance and so forth. But it's been the government that's stepped in to provide necessary housing improvements and housing. These people aren't necessarily adapted well to the capitalistic community that most of the world is set up as.
Jane has asked a question. Is there any estimate of how much recent destruction there has been from permafrost erosion?
I haven't seen figures, although if you take a look at the National Geographic that came out, there's vast damage on the Eastern Hemisphere. The development is quite light in the Western Hemisphere. People stay south of the Arctic Circle for the most part.
We have one last question before we switch over to Judy. Alex asks, do all major commercial buildings and multi-story living facilities require the heat displacement rods to the exterior of the structure?
Most of them use the strategy of piles and setting the whole building up off the ground so the winds don't force snow against the buildings. So they basically do that. Although some of the bigger buildings do use the thermosiphoning devices, and large buildings have special piles that are driven down, which indeed are made in such a way so that air can circulate around and maintain the coolness, the coldness of the environment.
Thank you so much. So I think this would be a great time for Judy to switch over.
Super. And
Slide.
yes. Okay, here
Perfect.
we go. So we're going to an astonishingly different Arctic as we move hemispheres. This is part 2. So we're going now to the European and Asian Arctic. And this is roughly the outline I will pursue. Some initial remarks, and then first the Russian Arctic and then the Norwegian. So the Eastern Arctic includes both Europe and Asia, specifically Russia, Norway, Sweden, and Finland. Note how the red isotherm line rises above the Arctic Circle in most of this Eurasian half. Latitude alone does not define an environment. We need additional input. This upper map right shows the extensive permafrost, which Brooke explained earlier, which affects some of these regions more than others, particularly affecting Siberian Russia and the archipelago called Svalbard, while Murmansk, the Russian city Murmansk, and coastal Norway are permafrost free, very different. The lower map defining Russian ecoregions reminds us, this I think at 8th grade, the key northern zones, the treeless tundra and the boreal forested taiga. That went too fast. The Arctic is rich in minerals, oil and gas, especially in the Eastern Hemisphere. And finally, climate. In the summer of 2020, the Arctic experienced a major heat wave. Siberia was exceptionally affected, even while winters remain notably cold. So now we're going to really zoom in on Russia first. The Russian Arctic is home to many indigenous peoples, from Sami in the far west to Chukchi in the far east, and many others in between. Reindeer, caribou to us, are essential to those who dwell above the Arctic Circle, providers of clothing, transport, shelter, and nourishment, a source of life. Here are some indigenous Arctic herders with their animals: Sami, Evenki, Yakut, Chukchi. Most indigenous Arctic herders are nomadic or semi-nomadic, moving seasonally with their animals. They build their dwellings from reindeer hides or turf. Wood is scarce and reserved for structure and detail. Note the various types and their names: a Sami Goati, and then it's Chum, a Yakut Balagan, and a Chukchi Yaranga. What happened to them? They're here. It goes by itself, I think. The Nenets inhabit the Western Russian Arctic. The small map, upper right, notes the northern tundra Nenets' winter-summer migration in the Yamalo Peninsula. The Nenets' dwelling is called the Chum. Easily transportable, the circular tent is structured with long poles, thickly covered with reindeer skins. And I cannot explain the television set, so don't ask me about it. Where do they get the power? migration. Households are packed onto sleds pulled by reindeer who join the herd's long queue moving toward the next destination. Today, only a few indigenous peoples of Russia's north maintain their herds and migrations. Why? They were decimated first by Cossack invaders, forced during the 20th century into Soviet collectives, and competed for their territories with new industries. At last, in the 1990s, they were finally granted legal control of their lands and traditions. So let's look at their historic context from a Western perspective. The Pomors, meaning seasiders, were Russians who in the 12th century moved north into the White Sea coast around today's Archangel. And from there they ventured westward by ship to trade with early towns in Norway. Here's one of their wooden Orthodox churches and a depiction of them with their wooden boats, kuchas, in port at Archangel. The Pomors also traveled by sea to the east into northern Siberia, where they founded a short-lived trading post called Gazaya, depicted here with its fortified Kremlin. It was also known as Russia's first Arctic city. It was the fur trade, sable above all, that enticed the Russians, including Pomors, into Siberia, where they could trade with indigenous peoples, see on the lower right. But the coveted northern sea route, a northeast passage, remained of vital interest to both Russians and Europeans until, after several partial ventures, a Finnish-Swedish explorer named Nordenskjöld finally succeeded, only in 1879. However, Russians conquered Siberia overland and by river, not by sea, during the 16th and 17th centuries, the Tsars enlisting Cossacks to do the heavy lifting. Their goal was to secure, of course, that precious sable trade. These artworks depict their river travels and also their subjugation of native peoples, an all too familiar story. When we think of Siberia, we inevitably think of exile and forced labor. Whether the katorga of Tsarist times or the later Gulag, it didn't take much to be sent east. The prisoners built the Trans-Siberian Railroad, as well as mines, factories, and new cities, as we shall see. This Arctic map focuses me on the next part of my talk, which is to move to modern times through case studies of three places: European Murmansk and Siberian Norilsk and Salikard. All three of these present the forces that drive the modern Russian Arctic: shipping and resource extraction. The importance of Murmansk cannot be overstated. It's a key port on the critical Northern Sea route and the link between European and Asian routes, located in a region rich in exportable materials. Also, Murmansk is the world's largest city above the Arctic Circle. This is not North America, folks, with 300,000 residents. Yet it enjoys the benefit of a modern subarctic climate with permafrost-free land and ice-free waters. It's also connected by rail with St. Petersburg. Murmansk is relatively new, the last city founded in Tsarist times, 1915, as a supply port during World War I. And during the Russian Civil War, Murmansk provided a base for Western support of the White Russians against the Red Bolsheviks. Then the city grew during the 1930s. And in the Second World War, Murmansk port served as the Anglo-American supply route. Look at those ships, but subsequently badly destroyed. After the war, the city grew quickly, reaching its peak population in 1989, 450,000 people. In Soviet fashion, Murmansk planners designed grand boulevards and new neighborhoods of slab block housing, much as elsewhere in the USSR. However, with the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991, Murmansk economy crashed and the population dropped by a full quarter. And while it has slowly transitioned to market economy and is and is hardly an isolated outpost, it still loses residents. Yet surrounded by hills and facing an inland off the Barents Sea, the site offers appealing vistas, even while individual buildings lack distinction. Today's economy revolves around the railroad, the port, and regional mining industries. Murmansk is the base for Russia's Arctic fleet of nuclear icebreakers. Note the Lenin upper left, which is now a museum, an example of what I think we should call naval architecture. The city center is focused around Five Corners Square, framed by public buildings and the massive Arctic Hotel, which is the tallest structure in the Arctic. We see a mix of earlier and newer 20th century buildings. Murmansk's civic architecture includes administrative buildings, universities, and museums. Here's a sampling. Conservatively neoclassical or functionally modern, nothing especially distinguished. The main boulevard, Leninsky Prospect, is lined with official buildings near the center and residential quarters beyond. Perhaps you know, religion was suppressed in the USSR between 1924 and 1988, when permission was finally granted to build the new Church of St. Nicholas to celebrate the millennium of Christianity in Russia. So this church above, Church of St. Savior on the Waters, was built in 2002 as part of the Seafarers Memorial. Its design imitates Russia's historic white churches of places like Suzdal and Vladimir near Moscow. And memorials, as fitting for a port city, Murmansk Seafarers Memorial comprises that church and a lighthouse with a long stair descending through a hillside park. In the distance is Alyosha, a 1974 monument to the defenders of the Soviet Arctic, a monumental soldier in his memorial park. And housing? In Murmansk, dwellings were built of wood, but then in the Soviet era of masonry, the pervasive concrete slab blocks, more recently taller buildings with elevators. Soviet housing of the 60s and 70s is named for the leader of the Cold War era, Nikita Khrushchev, who's credited with launching massing housing initiatives. This system of precast concrete slabs, assembled in repetitive modules, was applied all over the USSR and beyond. Khrushchevka could be built fast to satisfy acute housing needs, but these buildings are tired now, and Murmansk suffers from degraded and vacant buildings. With the population still in decline, there's little incentive to build new, although the need for housing improvement is well known. So what about the future? In hopes of stimulating the economy and population growth, the city government has developed plans for a new Murmansk waterfront development, presented to Putin in 2019. Let's not quite call this architecture, it's too crude, rather a vision to compete with glamorous architecture around the world. It includes grand hotels, Congress Center, office towers, and they do report over 40 new apartment buildings. I have read that this project's prospects, along with free trade status for all of Russia's Arctic ports, which is very important, looked promising before COVID arrived. Well, here's another future vision at a much smaller scale, the result of a 2020 international design competition for a new city park in Murmansk. Here are some images of the site and renderings of the winning design for Coziness Valley. Yes, just a park, yet we know parks have potential as catalysts. Think Central Park in New York, Parc La Villette in Paris, or Zaradier in Moscow. First place went to a firm from St. Petersburg, and I do hope this one gets built. So onward to Siberia, east. Across the Ural Mountains in northern Siberia, the Russians found resources to fuel their empire and created new cities with the sole purpose of extracting and processing these riches, among them Norilsk. It's the world's second largest Arctic city after Murmansk, and the furthest north, population around 180,000. Norilsk is the center of valuable nickel, copper, and palladium industries. Think electric cars, folks. And by consequence, a notably polluted place. It's remote, isolated, and officially a closed city. You or I cannot go to Norilsk without permission, thank goodness. A freight-only rail line links Norilsk with Dudinka's shipping port, but there is an airport nearby. Inviting? The Arctic environment surrounding Norilsk, sub-freezing on average, and a tundra ecosystem with continuous permafrost does have its beauties, to be sure. Founded in the 20s and officially in 1935 for its mining purposes, the city was then master planned, both mining and urban construction to be realized by forced labor. Norilsk was a gulag. Architecturally, the design presents a grandiose and familiar variation on Stalinist neoclassicism. Norilsk's sad gulag history has lately been memorialized. While one single wooden house is preserved as home of the man who discovered the region's mineral riches. The city that the Gulag prisoners built appears grand indeed along its main boulevards and in its squares. Over the decades, Norilsk acquired the cultural and educational institutions that celebrate its region and past, including a museum and a polar drama center, and schools for all ages of students, more cheerful within than without. New religious buildings serve Norilsk's diverse population. The Orthodox buildings, historically Russian in architecture, and this delicious turquoise mosque, which relieves its grim surroundings. The city's housing stock, oh gosh, is relentlessly Soviet, mainly the Khrushchevsky concrete slab block types, and later taller versions. With the population of Norilsk decreasing, it is, and despite hardship pay for isolation and dangerous work, numerous apartment buildings do lie vacant. Well, life at home is constrained by small spaces, minimal amenities, and the unforgiving climate. The polar night here lasts for 45 days. I think they're just breaking out of it now. Also, life expectancy is lower here by 10 years than for average Russians. You would ask about permafrost. So they build up on these posts, but the effects of melting permafrost due to climate change is more and more evident. And we know that Siberia is acutely affected. Industrial Norilsk. Industrial Norilsk has its own rough beauty, architecture indeed of another sort. But the inevitable spills and noxious emissions have taken their toll on the region. Best, perhaps, are Norilsk stage-set boulevards, especially when filled by people during a celebration like the annual Day of Metals. But I ask myself, is any of this architecture? Well, let's try Salakard for a very different aspect of the Siberian Arctic. It's called by some the Arctic capital of Russia, and now it's possibly the richest per capita and happiest city in Russia, all Russia. I just read this, I don't know. Now it's the administrative center of the Yamalo-Nenets Autonomous Okrug. Its Salakard is an old town with an architecturally assertive new life, quite the opposite to Norilsk, and a bit less frigid in climate, sitting directly on the Arctic Circle. Founded by Russian settlers in 1595 after the conquest of Siberia, then named Obdorsky, became a successful trading settlement with a port on the Ob River. It was renamed Salakard in 1933. A reproduction of the 17th century Kremlin is an open-air museum. The traditional wooden town with its old city hall survived into the 20th century when Salakard became yet another Siberian place of exile. Its prisoners building a part of Stalin's never completed transpolar railway and were entertained at Salakard's 501 Gulag Theater, lower left. Unlike Norilsk, Salakard prospered after the fall of the Soviet Union, benefiting from the region's oil and natural gas resources, just then coming online. Investment flowed in, as did workers. The population now nears 50,000. Note in the lower left how the pipelines are elevated to allow the passage of reindeer herds and attempt at coexistence. The city's economy is diverse. Administration, fisheries, transportation, trading. Diversity is key to its survival. So let's survey a sampling of the colorful buildings of New Salikhard, many pictured on this goofy map, all built since 2000. The administrative buildings for the autonomous Okrug and the brand new city hall, too bad, lower left. Shiny housing and commercial buildings or painted up older housing. This concert and Congress hall, quite a hunker, and the so-called Torch Bridge with its restaurant up above. Well, enough of that for me. Enough of that for me. In my mind, this is what happens to architecture when new money flows in just a little too fast. So let's move to Norway and to a more promising perspective on architecture. This map shows northern Norway, its complex coastline between Bodø and Kirkenes, and an inset of the extreme Arctic archipelago, Svalbard. Above the Arctic Circle, northern Norway is moderated by ocean currents, thus subarctic in climate and landscape, and the coastal zone is free of permafrost. Some background: the Vikings were the earliest Nordic Arctic explorers who traded and settled both west and east, traveling mostly by ship. This map shows their wide-ranging routes, their settlements, and their homelands in today's Scandinavia. Circled in red is a peninsula called Lofoten, where a Viking settlement has been reconstructed, including a chieftain's longhouse. This upper-class residence is structured with massive carved wooden framework, evidence of the great Nordic building tradition. The Sea Sami, long ago and now, continue to inhabit northern Scandinavia and northwestern Russia, and traditionally fish for Arctic cod, an important Norwegian resource to this day. The Sea Sami lived in wood-framed, sod-covered guati and built wooden racks to dry their fish then and now. Both inland reindeer herding Sami and coastal Sea Sami still live in Norway's north. Modern times. Let's go to Tromso. Long inhabited, a trading and fishing port with mixed Norse and Sami heritage and a base for early polar exploration, Tromso is now the world's third largest city within the Arctic Circle, a population approaching 72,000. Today, it's known as much for science, education, and tourism as for its seafaring past, and for a wealth of good buildings. Modern architecture altered Tromso following World War II, most strikingly in 1965 with the aptly named Arctic Cathedral, its stepped white frame, an iconic landmark and wintertime beacon that complements the landscape in shape and expression. The University of Tromso, now merged with the Arctic University of Norway, specializes in the study of regional cultures and environments. The campus has a good share of interesting buildings with an outdoor labyrinth as a focal point of its humanities campus. Tromso is a base for Arctic studies. Since 1998, the home of the Norwegian Polar Institute. They have outposts also on Svalbard. Beside the handsome Institute building is its associated, rather oddly formed aquarium called Polaria. One architect designed them both, go figure. Tromso has lots of impressive housing, and here's just one example. This is a project for a passive energy row house development that shows that good Arctic design isn't limited to institutions. Man, oh man, this is not Russia. A common entrance walkway is flanked by storage units and dwelling entrances. The interior coziness is offset by ample fenestration and rooftop terraces, lots of wood, of course, and excellent lighting fixtures. There are several museums in Tromso, including this one still in planning, the Arctic University Museum of Norway, for a site between the existing modern art museum, and the water. Henning Larsen, a distinguished Danish architect, describes his design as a path from town to sea. The renderings show abstract building blocks framing a broad stair that descends to a shoreline plaza where the museum opens to the waterfront, simple and elegant. Let's leave Tromso and get out and about. Here is the Samedigi, or Sami Parliament Complex, located in an inland village in an 80% Sami district. This building houses the Norwegian Sami's representative body, 39 representatives and a president. The council chamber is formed as an abstraction of a Sami dwelling. The Oslo-based architects secured this project through a government-sponsored competition. The Nordics are great at competitions. It's wonderful for young firms. A Sami library and chamber of commerce are included in its semicircular wing. Lots of wood in its structure and detailing. So what about tourism? It's a major industry in Norway. If you've already visited, you know the country's scenic and cultural wonders. Norway's official Scenic Routes program consists of detailed touring options. Check out their excellent website, several of them in the far north. Each incorporates special architectural features. The Varango route, circled in red upper right, takes bird watchers to architect-designed shelters for viewing Arctic bird life, and there's apparently lots. The designer of these, based in northern Vardo, is a bird watcher. Along that route, you'll encounter the extraordinary Steelness Memorial, which celebrates the 17th century execution of 91 suspected witches. This is not Salem. Swiss architect Peter Zumthor partnered with the late French-American sculptor Louise Bourgeois to create the memorial, consisting of Zumthor's 400-foot-long pavilion honoring each of the accused, and a steel and glass container for Bourgeois's sculpture called The Damned, the Possessed, and the Beloved, with its perpetually burning chair. And what a magnificent sight. The Lofoten scenic route follows the Lofoten Peninsula to its tip. And by the way, it's got that Viking site along the way, with a number of interesting rest stops. Here are just two. Along that way is also the Egum rest stop, an archaic seeming amphitheater shaped by walls built of gabions, those metal mesh crates filled with stones, below remains of a World War II German radar station. This rest stop was designed by the famous Oslo, well, now international firm called Snøhetta. At the terminus of the Lofoten route is Reinhalsen village, an old fishing port with vernacular wooden buildings and amazing surroundings. This remote facility will eventually serve people keen to experience the best of whale watching, and it's amazing apparently, from this point at Ardenes. The design lies somewhere between landscape and building, perhaps a breaching Leviathan. This aptly named whale exhibition and viewing project was won by competition by Dorte Mandrup, a Danish architect who claims to specialize in irreplaceable places, and so she does. Tourism for some means retreat or refuge. At the Fleinveer Refugium is an Arctic retreat for artists on the remote Fleinveer archipelago. A musician enlisted architects from two firms who collaborated in creating this collection of tiny structures, each with its own function, that disturb the fragile environment as little as possible. You can apply for a retreat here in my dreams. And this is where you might, this is where you might sleep and dine. Most Arctic tourists seek hotels that honor the natural environment. The Svart Hotel is an energy positive design, also by Snøhetta, set over the water at Hollandsfjord, below the Svartisen Glacier and directly on the Arctic Circle. The hotel would soon be in construction, but it's now on hold for reasons I suppose we could easily guess. This hotel touches in its environment lightly, and the site is spectacular. It's impossible, however, to leave Norway without venturing out to Svalbard, a high Arctic archipelago, once a terra nullius or no man's land, that provided many countries a base first for whaling, then for coal mining, and now administered by Norway for scientific and touristic pursuits. Norway's administrative center is at Longyearbyen, a small town located at over 78 degrees north latitude. It is up there. Many people know of Svalbard for its Arctic scenery and wildlife, but perhaps also as home to the global seed vault, which was initiated to preserve samples of seeds from gene banks worldwide, insurance against losses from future global disasters. The Norwegians paid for it. The Global Crop Diversity Trust runs it, and seed storage is free. It opened in 2008. Apart from its projecting portal with entry artwork that's illuminated at night, most of the architecture so far is underground. However, a seed vault center titled the Ark, designed by guess who, Snøhetta, is planned, but now also on hold to showcase the vault's contents and explain Svalbard's ideal preservation environment. Two structures are planned: a low dark rectangle for entrance and services, and an adjacent white silo-like volume for exhibitions. A glass connecting bridge joins them. Within the Oculus-lit exhibition volume is an inner ceremony room with one living tree that represents Svalbard's prehistoric past, some 56 million years ago, when such trees were plentiful. Its past, you ask? For Svalbard, alas, is experiencing dramatic effects of climate change, rising temperatures causing serious permafrost erosion and glacial melting. Even the seed vault has required improvements to keep the waters out. In closing, the entire Arctic is experiencing extreme climate change, affecting all the places we've shown tonight. Architecture plays only a partial, yet we believe essential role in what lies ahead. Thanks very much. We welcome your questions. And here are some email addresses where you can reach us. And thanks to Julia and Jane.
Thank you very much, Judy. That was very interesting to see the differences in those case studies between what's happening in Russia and in Norway. Very, very stark contrasts. Susanna asks, and this was a question that could be for you or for Brooke or both. Can you speak to whether climate change is affecting the design of buildings? How about renewable electric use?
Well, I imagine there's a lot of, well, first of all, with polar winter, it's a little bit hard to collect sun when, for a couple of months of the year, it's dark, not a couple of months, but at least 40 days. So electricity, well, on Svalbard, for example, they're still using coal because they had mining there and it's handy. Because as you know, everything has to be brought in, so they have to generate their own. As for other energy sources,
in the West, they're still using a lot of oil in a lot of these places. I haven't seen much that indicates that they've moved to things like windmills, just because of the ruggedness of the terrain. And also on the West, the winds, that the little schools that I showed you, the old schools in the 70s, are designed for 100-mile-an-hour winds.
Anyway, I'm hopeful that during the big conference that there will be more conversation about this topic, because it is obviously urgent. And in our research, we actually haven't come upon a lot that goes directly toward your question. I'm sorry.
Oh, that's okay. Thank you so much anyway. There were some questions about the grid designs of the cities. And Paul was wondering if there was anything special that was done to accommodate snow plowing. We did have one person chime in, Susanna, who noted that in her research, the building and street designs in Tromso were designed to permit fire trucks originally horse-drawn through the town because fire was a greater concern than snow. But is the grid design something that you've seen often?
Well, the towns were built of wood in early days too, so that was a massive threat. I have seen photographs, I didn't include any, of fleets of snow plows because they have extraordinary snow in Murmansk or in Norilsk or in Svalbard, and they do plow. They have bus systems. I mean, in Norilsk, having a car is a kind of a compromised blessing because there's really nowhere to go. Similarly, in Iqaluit, there's nowhere to go. You know, snowmobiles are a greater advantage, and in Norilsk, they take their snowmobiles up into the tundra countryside to kind of get out of town. Those grid buildings, to go back to that earlier part of the question, are they felt they were protecting the courtyard spaces somewhat from what are extraordinary winds, but it certainly is monomaniacal the way this architecture persists. But that's the Russian way. The Russians build big and they build repetitively. I mean, traditionally. In modern Russia, of course, things are becoming quite different since, particularly in the 21st century.
We have a comment / question from Jeffrey that says, couldn't one say that Norway could not build what it does and live how they do without Russia supplying all those dirty materials affordably? Norway is beautiful, but has the luxury of ignoring the poverty and desperation of Russian industrial life.
Well, there's a big border, I guess, that first of all, the Norwegians do have mining and they do have the North Sea oil. So they are certainly not resource dependent. I think lots of other parts of Europe are, as I understand it, much more dependent on Russia's reserves. Norway has just had a very fortunate modern trajectory, not to mention their incredibly good taste.
One of the problems in the Western Hemisphere is that right now it's underdeveloped, right? With the population of less than 200,000 within the Arctic Circle. There's a fear of the destruction that's being done by the open pit mining that's allowed up there. And there are photographs, even on Baffin Island, of places where fish have tried to escape the chemicals and sort of moved up rivers to escape the pollution that's up there. So I'm sure going back to the dirtiness of Russia, I don't know that it's dirty, but they do have a lot of mines there. They do make as much use as they can of extracting the natural resources.
They have severe pollution, Norilsk, extremely so.
Well, thank you so much. I do want to mention that even though this is the Camden Public Library's last talk on the Camden Conference for our community events, there are a few more that folks might be interested in, and you can find out more about those by visiting the Camden Conference's website. I do happen to know that the Kennebunk Library is going to be doing one coming up soon about oil companies and the effects of the oil industry in Russia on the indigenous populations. So if you're interested in that, please visit the Camden Conference's website. Once again, we have recorded this, and if you are interested in sharing this program, I will be uploading it to the library, the Camden Public Library's YouTube channel by tomorrow. With that, Judy and Brooke, I want to thank you so much for sharing. You have clearly put a lot of thought and research into this. And we have a number of comments that have come into the chat expressing that as well, and that they think that this is a very interesting program that you have presented. So thank you again for all the hard work.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks very much.
And thank you to everyone who joined us tonight. Please check librarycamden.org to find out all the latest upcoming programs. You are all always welcome. And with that, I wish you all a wonderful evening. Good night.